Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's ACN Flash webinar, Practical Project Management for Remote Teams and Communications. We've got a couple of housekeeping items for you to keep in mind. The slides and the recording of the presentation will be made available after this presentation. Also, we enjoy hearing from you, so feel free to post any questions, comments, or thoughts in the chat as we go along. We'll definitely be keeping up with that throughout Annisa's presentation. So more about our presenter. Annisa Wanat is a strategist and storyteller. She develops solutions to strategic planning and project management challenges, boosts effective programming, and tells powerful stories. Annisa works with nonprofits and other mission-driven organizations, focusing on startups, civic groups, and small and mid-sized associations that rely on volunteer support. So without any further ado, Annisa, it's your show.
Thank you, Ashi, for that great introduction. One thing I want to add, the reason that I decided to focus on the communications aspect of project management for this 30-minute webinar is because before I started consulting, I actually worked around the globe with people who were in different time zones quite regularly, or sometimes even on different continents. So to get started, I want to start with my definition of practical project management. So I use it as a standard process by which projects are planned, implemented, and evaluated. Now, before we get into talking about communications, we need a quick refresher to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of some of the lingo, right? So why does project management matter? When I work with organizations on a larger project management training, I get a variety of answers. But the reason that I think nonprofits need to focus in on it the most is because it definitely helps management of workloads and communications, right? Especially important for nonprofits is the effective and efficient use of limited resources. It's also very helpful for strategy and implementation and evaluation. And finally, with onboarding and institutional memory, right? So when somebody comes in, especially now that so many teams are working remotely, they have a project management plan or a path to follow. And at the same time, when somebody leaves, whoever takes over them, in full project management, will have a list of documents or, a full project management plan. So they know where things have gone and where they go. So projects, programs, and portfolios. A lot of times these are used interchangeably, but a project is a temporary endeavor for unique results. It's going to be the smallest of these, right? Program is a group of projects, and a portfolio is the projects, the programs, and any operations that are managed to meet strategic objectives. One of the ways nonprofits use these a lot that they don't even realize is when they're thinking about their planning, right? If you're writing a grant proposal, you're going to be using the project management plan, or you write about it in terms of the project cycle. The same thing with your annual work plans or your multi-year strategic plans. So you will find many different, if you Google project management cycle, you're going to find a lot of different graphics. This is actually one I have kind of developed myself over the years, specifically for nonprofits. You've got a lot of the same elements that you'll find if you Google, except for nonprofits, adding the celebration is a really important element of the cycle when you're done with something. So you can celebrate your volunteers and your successes. So at each stage, I've developed, I've thrown in a lot of the different things that nonprofits tend to do at each stage. So people can see how they're already doing project management, and even if they're not thinking about it. And you'll see communication is at every portion of the process. So I'm going to take a second and think about, why don't you drop in the chat box what issues you are working on, you're running into when you work on remotely.
Okay, let me take a look and see what we've got. Come on, guys, don't be shy. I definitely can attest to something. I can offer something up right now. It goes back to how people interpret and read things through email, through text message. I seem to run into a lot of issues where we're having distractions, putting out skirmishes and brush fires, involving that emotional side versus focusing on the work. Oh, here we go. We've got somebody saying bottlenecks. I don't know if remote work is the problem.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that one.
Okay, it's the last comment we've got in the chat goes back to bottlenecks.
Mm-hmm.
They're asking and wondering if remote work is indeed the problem.
Okay. And that's something that we can, is it the problem? I will write that down. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So a lot of things that other groups that I've been working with talk into is they're also running into either too much communication work remotely, right? Or too little communication, or the wrong kind of communication, or there's too many options on how to communicate, right? Should I IM? Should I Slack? Should I email? Should I like pick up the phone and call? What about Zoom? There's just a lot more communication now. And then the different people have different preferences. Now, the next two questions I'm going to have you just kind of think about and write the answers on yourselves, but think about in your teams, and this will actually, I'll be curious about whether or not bottlenecks and remote working is the problem. What kind of communications were you having, issues were you having before you started working remotely? Just think about that for a couple seconds. And be honest with yourself. What's the same? What communications are different now that you're working remotely? So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between coordination and communication, right? Right? Communication is the straight imparting of information. Coordination is the different elements of an organization working together so that they can be effective. And I think that a lot of people that are new to working remotely are much more, they're probably struggling more with coordination than they are with communication. Because if you're used to walking through an office and picking up little pieces of information by the water cooler next to somebody's office. I had one job where all of the important decisions were made on smoking breaks. So the non-smokers used to go with the smokers because they knew that's when all the good stuff was going to happen, right? If we're working in different places, we don't have the chance to have that accidental information exchanges, right? So you can coordinate without communicating, but you can't communicate without coordinating. So is your organization communicating or coordinating, I think, is the question you need to be asking yourself. So what I've done is I've put together the different kinds of tools that people have been using before and are using now that we're working remotely. You know, these are the standard types of tools people are using, you know, your phones, your texts, your DMs, your checklists, whether it's digital or analog. You know, when you're in office, you can have a big whiteboard that says we need to do X, Y, or Z next, but you know, that's harder, that becomes harder, and converting that to something digital when we're working remotely, right? And these are other tools that I don't think people think about as communication coordination tools, but when they're in place, it does make working remotely easier because people have something to rely on. The left side is much more communication tools, whereas the right side is more coordination tools. And I want to talk a little bit about internal communications as well as a Racy chart as terms of tools that you can help if you're having issues with coordinating that could help smooth the process now that you're working remotely. Has anyone worked with a Racy chart before? Or a Racy chart? I've actually heard it both ways.
A lot of people are incredibly curious as to know what it is.
Excellent. And now I have put the stupid box in front of my screen again. So, excellent. So yeah, Racy or Racy stands for responsible, accountable, coordinated, and informed. It's a matrix that you can use to make sure the right people are getting the right information about a particular project or set of activities. This could be internal or external stakeholders. Another similar tool that I've run across lately that I'm beginning to adapt and move on to more is actually the same concept, and I'll show you a sample in a second. But they use the Mocha Chart, which is manager, owner, consultant, helper, approved. And I think both of these are really good project management tools to help make sure you know who needs to be communicating. So I put
Jamie.
Oh, yeah.
And Jamie has popped in the chat saying, although Racy charts are key in program management, a lot of organizations and teams do not use those tools.
No, but should they? I think becomes the question, right? And I'm sneaking in because Jamie worked with me remotely. So she and I know we never use these types of things. But there were regular communications channels set up. Has anybody used anything like this before? So largely what you want to do is on the left side, you've got all of your different projects. And along the far left column, and then across you have the who's responsible, accountable, informed, consulted, right? So I think a lot of people, when you set up, if people use Slack, this is becoming a little easier because you can put the right people in the right channel so that everybody gets informed at least, but it doesn't get at accountable, consulted, responsible. So say for your annual gala, and I think it's important to keep the board on this as well, right? So your annual gala, the board needs to be consulted in the fundraising, but the executive director is ultimately responsible. Whereas your program managers are going to be more responsible with help from the program assistants. So although, yeah, I agree with Jamie, it's something that is not used enough, which is one of the reasons I wanted to bring it out in this organization. Now, the next thing is more of an internal communications chart. I think a lot of organizations are used to external communications channels. Everybody knows who's allowed to talk to the media, right? Who's allowed to say what, who's allowed to post to Facebook, who's not. But when it comes to internal communications, this is actually something I set up for an organization I was helping with set up some project management structures. It was a organization that has always been remote. They have maybe 10 to 15 staff, depending on who's working. And they have 3 generations working on the teams, right? So where the younger generations want to text and the older generations want to pick up the call, and then somebody came in and said, let's use Slack, it resulted in a lot of information going to the same channel 3 times, or some of the information not getting to the right people. So we worked with them to just kind of set up some guidelines so that when they were starting a project or they needed to do things, they could start thinking through how they should do that, right? So are you just communicating information? Are you just telling people information? Or are you trying to coordinate activities, right, is your first decision point? If you're just learning to trying to communicate information, you can go straight through email. Assuming everybody in your office checks email. I mean, one of the biggest problems this organization was they had 2 people that didn't check email about every 2 days, which the rest of the team was very surprised by, but they promised, if they decided to adopt this chart that they would go along with it, right? But, or are you trying to coordinate activities and get some decisions made? At which point email ends up with a lot of back and forth. So you want to work on something that's a little more interactive, whether it's Zoom or Slack, depending on how many people are involved, how time sensitive it is, and everything else. So those are the 2 tools I had to present. I wanted to go to any questions or anything right now. So I don't know, Ashi, what we've got? What do we have?
So there's been a lot of feedback
Okay.
to the particular Racy charts. Of course, we've got someone saying that they're using one with one of their groups and it helps a great deal with communication. Of course, Jamie, you guys are tag teaming today. Very fun. She said, yeah, I wish more organizations would actually use them because with remote work, they will be useful. I've got somebody else saying, now that I see it visually, I have used it loosely with some clients. And then, of course, Jamie, with her last comment on this particular matter, she said that these would be really great tools for onboarding. And I have to agree. I am familiar with the Mocha, but I myself personally have never used the Racy chart. So this is fascinating.
Oh, that's interesting because I've always used Racy and Mocha was new to me. And I was like, ooh, I like that much better. I like Mocha better because it's a little more action oriented. Like, I own this, I need to know about it, I'm helping, I am the ultimate decision maker, right? I'm curious about the person that asked about bottlenecks and whether or not remote communication, just remote work, was the problem. It's the answer to that, and because I wanted to go back to it once we got through this, is really it's going to depend on your organization, right? Every organization is going to go run through different challenges. You know, and if you want to ask something more specific about problems you're running into, this would be the time to make that happen.
Well, I have to say, I love what you talked about earlier about the fact that organizations are focusing either too much on communication or too little. I've had conversations with some of my own clients over the last few months where it goes back to, oh my goodness, are we having another meeting? When we were in person, we didn't even meet about this kind of stuff. It was offline, it was through an email. And yet now when we are using other communication tools and methods, we're having meetings about this stuff. What gives? I've never been to so many meetings in my life, is what one of my clients had told me before I stepped in. So bottleneck, that was a great word. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Oh yes, here we go. I've got one more question for you. Besides the communication tools that you've offered, obviously we know things such as Slack and whatnot. What other tools would you recommend for communication?
So, and that's one point that I was going to actually make right before we close, but this is the perfect time to do it. I think, you know, a lot of times when people, you know, want me to come in and consult on project management, they want an end result, like, right? Should we use Trello? Should we use Asana? Should we use XYZ? Like, what should we buy to make our communication and coordination and project management better? And that's one of the reasons I think trying to figure out whether your issues are communication or coordination is important. Because if you're not communicating and coordinating correctly before you buy a tool, at the end, you're also, you know, when you invest money in one of those project management systems, you're largely just going to be paying for very big task lists. So, I mean, I can tell you the tools that I use a little more often than others. And again, this is just communication. When it comes to overall project management, you need to be thinking about how your organization plans. You know, do you use Gantt charts? Are you setting up concrete project management plans that have milestones along the way, that have built-in evaluation systems so that every quarter or every 6 months, you're looking back, right, on the project management cycle to make sure everything is going the way it's supposed to be. So the tools are great and every one of them is helpful. I use ClickUp largely just because it has Gantt charts are one of my favorite things in the world, and ClickUp has Gantt charts at a reasonable price. Most of the free versions of a lot of these tools end up being task lists, at which point if you want to use a free version, I'd go with Trello. And then Slack is also great for communications if you already know how to set your channels up correctly. And if you use Slack, I would highly recommend Googling Slack guidelines, and looking at some samples of that so that everybody is on the same page as to what channel is used for what information, because the little descriptive at the top isn't always interpreted correctly. Yeah, that would be my overall discussion on tools. But again, tools are only as good as the systems you have in place to put into them.
Right. We've got a couple of comments in the chat here. I definitely agree with what you're saying. You know, all these platforms are tools. They're meant to assist and help, right? Not duplicate the work, but you can't substitute talent with tools alone, right? So one of the questions I've got a couple coming through here, Annisa. One is, you know, where do you start? You've got charts, you've got software, you've got tools. It's incredibly overwhelming. You've mentioned the Gantt charts. Why am I not surprised by that, Annisa? But the truth of the matter is that it can be overwhelming. So in terms of taking, you know, those bite-sized chunks, one, where do you start in identifying the right tool? And two, if you're already using a particular tool, when do you know it's time to switch over? So that's a big question we've got, followed up by a couple of more.
All right, so yes, project management in general is overwhelming. If you look at project management classes, they're thousands of dollars and take years, unless you're in the international development sector, at which point it is a little more reasonable, which is actually how I started getting into all of this. Deciding whether you want or need a new tool is going to be considered like any other project, right? You need to assess where the problems are, right? So are your problems with communication or coordination? Are your problems with reports not turning in on time, right? Where are your gaps? Where are the word that somebody used earlier, where are the bottlenecks? What's causing the problems? Is it over communication or under communication as itself? Or is it something deeper? Is it down to not having an annual work plan or an overarching strategic plan? Project management is, this is one of those things where it's like, it's simple. I don't understand it, but that's the way my brain works, right? It very much likes this system, and anything I do, whether it's writing a grant or planning a vacation, I kind of, look at it as a project. And at first, when I say that, a lot of times in presentations, people are like, what do you mean you project manage your vacation? And then they start thinking about it, and they do it as well. They just might not be as big a geek about a spreadsheet as I am. I will actually have Trisha send out, I have an overview. I have a couple blogs, and you can go to my website and find this, and I'll have this in the information. But I have a blog on several of the different tools that you can use and how I find them helpful, which might help you identify where you are in the process. And the person that asked about how do you know if it's time to use a different tool, it's the same consideration, right? You need to figure out where your bottlenecks are, whether it's time to adopt or change a tool. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Annisa. Go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say the one thing, IT departments are actually really fantastic at project management. So if you work in an organization large enough to do them, maybe think about, if you have an IT person, they might not be amazing at project management, but if you have an entire department that is switched over, from one system to another or done any kind of IT upgrades over the last 2 years, they will do all this stuff. They may use slightly different words, and you'll want to turn them into nonprofit words, but think about using them for their skill sets in project management rather than only thinking about them for IT is also quite helpful.
Well, I think that's fantastic. We do have one last question. I think this is a terrific one. We have Lydia from our chat asking, how do you manage pushback from people who don't want to learn or manage a new PM tool?
Any change management needs to be managed with communication, right? So whether you're introducing a new system to do your communications plan, whether you're doing a new IT system, you can't just walk in and say, this is how we're going to do it. You need to go through a crisis management or a project management cycle or a change management cycle, which has, shockingly, communication as the key part. And you have to do it in stages over time. You know, maybe start with the people that are most comfortable doing it, and so they can give testimony as to how helpful it is, so that the people are a little more hesitant would be brought on board. And you're always going to have, especially since we have 4 to 5 generations now in offices, you're going to have very different levels of comfort with communication. You know, from those who are very uncomfortable using the telephone to those who are very comfortable using something incredibly complex like Asana. So that is a reality of multi-generational teams that we just need to work through like any other change.
No, that's perfect. We call that living in the world of intelligence, right? How do you harness that workforce, that multi-general workforce? But yeah, that's all the questions we've got at this current point in time.
Great, then I will just, oh, why did those go out of order? I just wanted to go over quickly. So practical project management skills are essential to to nonprofits. That doesn't mean you have to go out and get a project management certificate or anything like that. It becomes very overwhelming and very expensive. Communications happens at every stage, and tools are only as good as their users. And thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Annisa, for that. I loved how many questions we had in the chat. It was absolutely fantastic. There were some really terrific questions. So up and coming, we always love to let you know what's going on in the world of ACN. We've got a few upcoming events. On September 21st, we have our President's Listening Session. On September 24th, we've got a virtual happy hour, speed dating like one-on-one, aka speed networking for our members. We've got a new member orientation on October 7th. And of course, you can register for all of these events on our website, and there will be times and of course the logistics available. So once again, thank you for those of us who were on the panel, and thank you, Annisa, for your time, and thank you for joining us, whether you were on Zoom or across our social media channels. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and make it a great week.